Netherlands over about a year, focusing on transportation mobility best practices. And so he's gonna give us some highlights of his experience, and I'll just turn it over to Alexander.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for having me here today. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. I'm a Twin Cities native. I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, went to college at the University of Minnesota, and did undergrad in engineering. And after graduating from college, I bought my first bicycle and started cycling around the Twin Cities. And I really bought it just kind of for recreational purposes, to go to the lake, to get some exercise. And then I started commuting a lot more. And it was almost like a spiritual awakening to me in terms of giving me a new perspective of how an urban city functions from a transportation standpoint. And it motivated me so much that I decided to switch careers. I was working at Accenture doing consulting and decided to go to graduate school. So I went to graduate school at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, to do a master's in city planning, and had a great 2 years there. And after that, still wasn't ready to come back home. And so I decided to go to the Netherlands for a year. So I went to the Netherlands for a year and did a mix of internships in public, private, and nonprofit arenas. And what I'm gonna present to you here today is just some of the highlights and some of the lessons learned from that experience and how they're applicable to Minneapolis. So once again, thank you so much for having me. It is really truly a pleasure after leaving the city 4 years ago to now be returning. Has anyone been to the Netherlands before? Okay, so a good chunk of folks. So when I started, I was in the city of The Hague, which you can see here with the big dot. It's on the North Sea. Think of it as the Washington, D.C. of the Netherlands. So the prime minister is there, all the political capacity within the city, within the country is housed there. And I think it's really interesting because most folks know the Netherlands as a great bicycle city. But what I think a lot of people don't really understand is that it's a great transportation city and country with a really good mode share balance. The national bike mode share is 25%, which is extremely high. The second closest to that is Denmark, and they're in the teens. The United States, I think, is between 0.3 to 0.5%. So a very different cycling environment. They also have a balance called a transit mode share, walking, and car. But I also think there's a misconception that Dutch cities just overnight became these great places for transportation. And if you look at the city I was in, The Hague, in the 1980s, it looked a lot like an American city. You see cars, you see a tram, and you see this poor woman on her bike over here without a bike lane. Almost, even by Minneapolis standards, that we consider that pretty bad. So you see that there was a lot of car usage in the city, not the best place for other modes of transportation in terms of how we envision the Netherlands being today. So this is that same street today, the Grote Marktstraat in Den Haag, or The Hague in English. You see a lot of people, you see a guy on an electric bike or a scooter, you see a lot of pedestrians, you see this thriving shopping area. In a lot of ways, it really reminds me of Nicollet Mall, which is a pedestrian-focused mall. This is a graphic rendering. I wasn't able to find a great image, so I chose this one. And so you see the city of The Hague, and you see Minneapolis, and you see similarities. So how did The Hague get to its present state today? How did it have this transformation that is this great pedestrian shopping mall area, but is also expanded into other spaces as well? And to understand that, you have to look at the history of the Netherlands to see how it transformed. So in the 1950s and 60s, Dutch cities followed the ideology of American cities. They saw the car as the future. And so they decided to integrate the car into their cities, but it didn't work really well. Dutch cities are much older, narrower streets, and because of this integration, they had really high traffic deaths. So if you look in the mid-1970s, there's 3,500 traffic deaths. There's a street here, and you can see there's a sign for 1 fatality and 7 injuries. So they're experiencing a lot of traffic deaths. They're experiencing mass suburbanization. They're also experiencing an oil crisis. And that's why you see the gentleman there riding on the freeway, because on the weekends they restricted car access. They didn't allow cars to be used on the weekends because they were experiencing an oil crisis and gas prices were rising. So you see all this momentum, and also it being centralized through citizens. So this says 150 deaths per month. So there was a lot of citizen opposition to all the traffic deaths that were occurring in the city. And so that created a lot of political pressure in the country, not just in each city, but in the country as a whole. And specifically, the city of The Hague responded to that in 1988 by creating a new traffic plan called the Kern Gezond, or a healthy core inner city. And this policy looked at 3 main functions: economic, land use, and transportation. And there was a strong focus on making the city attractive, mixing land use functions so people want to stay in the center city. And then from a transportation standpoint, the pedestrian had the highest priority in the city center. And they also decided to eliminate through-car traffic, because they felt, and I agree, that through-car traffic in a dense city is not efficient. There's a lot of pollution offset, there's a lot of extra congestion created with that, and it doesn't really create a cohesive place where people want to be if there's corridors that people are driving through really quickly. And here today, The Hague has the largest car-free zone in the Netherlands. So here's a map of it. You see the area in pink, which represents the car-free zone. And this didn't happen overnight. So this is, 30 years later, you're seeing this car-free zone. And as I said, it's the largest in the Netherlands. And the Grote Marktstraat, which I showed you in the original photo, is also the most per square foot retail space, has the highest rental values, because there's so much foot traffic there. The aesthetics are very well done. People want to be there, people want to shop there. It's just a very thriving place. And I actually recorded a video, I'll show you on the next slide. And so one part of the car-free zone is these markers you'll see here. So no cars are allowed in this area. It's for pedestrians and cyclists. The Dutch are not anti-car by any means, but they try to create areas where car access is limited, and they try to organize car access. And in this video, I'll show you that I recorded. You'll see how this plays out. So this is me on my bike with one hand filming, so don't tell my mom I did this. I don't think she'll be very happy with me. But you see, there's a gradient here to kind of signal to pedestrians and cyclists that there's cyclists coming. You see people and cyclists kind of intermixing, so the speeds are low, so people are allowed to self-navigate on their own. So that's one really big thing you'll see in the Netherlands. They try to lower speeds and allow people to self-navigate, so you don't have to separate modes as much. And you see there's a lot of people here, there's tons of malls here, there's terraces on the side. It's just a really thriving place. And this is, a Tuesday afternoon, maybe 2 o'clock. And the whole time I was there, I never saw an injury. So every day I rode this street to and from work and never saw a single injury. In here, there's tram tracks. So there's actually trams that go past here. There's buses, there's cars. And that white building right there is where I worked. So you see all this activity happening in this area. Let's pause that. Oh God.
Now we know the real reason why you're here.
Yeah, I know, right? And so you see all this, and it's really a focus on how do we reprioritize the public space? Because the Dutch believe that the public space, so let's say the public space is the downtown area, is inherently valuable. So what do we give the greatest priority to? The things that create the most economic value. And in dense urban areas, especially in the downtown, like Nicollet Mall, where you have a high population density of people walking, you want to cater to those modes that are the most efficient. And when you reprioritize public space, you see some amazing things. So you see the Grote Marktstraat in 1985. I mean, it looks like an American city. Obviously the cars are a little different, but it looks very much like an American city looks. And then you see it 30 years later, and down below there's actually a tram line that runs, there's people walking. You see the plots, which originally was a parking lot, right? And now it's a public terrace. And you see on a nice sunny day, there's tons of people out there. People want to be in these places because they've reprioritized it. And like I said, it's not anti-car, but how do we best optimize this space? And so this example talked a lot, the example I chatted about was a lot about The Hague. I'm going to talk about the city of Utrecht, the way they approach organizing their transportation system, and then I'm going to talk about Amsterdam, and then I'm going to pull it together for what Minneapolis can emulate. So Utrecht is a really interesting city because they're extremely dense city, they're a college town, but they have essentially created an A, B, and C zone with their transportation. So an A zone is what you would think of a typical neighborhood, an ideal neighborhood at least, where pedestrian and cycling are prioritized, cars and any other vehicles are considered guests. So there's no on-street parking or very little. Speeds are about a maximum of 15 miles per hour. And then the B zone is relatively equal. So cars, buses, cyclists, and pedestrians have equal priority. Usually there's not mode separation because the speeds are low enough that there's self-navigation that occurs. So The Hague is a mix of an A zone and B zones as well. And then a C zone is what you would consider an urban connector or an arterial. So definitely mode separation. Speeds for motor vehicles are about 45 miles per hour and higher. So this is definitely a place where you want to separate the modes. And this approach is really interesting because the way Utrecht controls this is that they have these designated A, B, and C zones. So you see an A zone is here in the city center, a shopping area, and another neighborhood. And then they have B zones all around it, and then C zones around that periphery of the city to get people in. So the way it would work ideally, somebody comes in on a car, they go to a parking ride, they take a tram into the city, and then they walk around. Or they take a tram and they bike around the city. Obviously Utrecht is very different than Minneapolis, but I still think there is a few lessons learned that the city of Minneapolis can implement. In the downtown, having more A and B zoned areas, maybe in uptown and places like that, having those type of transportation zoning options could be achieved through a long-term vision. And you guys can interrupt me at any time as well. We have a lot of time, I have a lot of content, but I want you guys to ask questions if you have them. And then moving into Amsterdam. So Amsterdam, I'm sure who's been to Amsterdam before? Okay. What were your thoughts of walking around in Amsterdam? It's crazy, is it? I thought it was crazy, but I remember I almost I was afraid to get hit by a tram. It's a pretty crazy place. And so obviously Amsterdam is extremely dense. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of modes going on. So you walk across the street in Amsterdam, you see a tram coming, and then there's people and there's cyclists, and the ground is flat and there's no gradient. So it's really confusing. So we all know that here in the United States, there's an approach called complete streets. So we want to provide equal modes, or every mode has kind of equal priority on a street, or at least every mode has a piece of infrastructure on every street. And in Amsterdam, they realized that's not really realistic in every part of the city. So what they're doing is giving priority to a few modes on each street. So hey, the trams are gonna run on these streets throughout the city, the cars are gonna run on these streets throughout the city. For the most part, cyclists and pedestrians have equal access on all streets and roads. And they're, over a long-term vision, implementing this through maintenance and regular improvements. And this approach is something that I also feel Minneapolis could adopt as well, of rethinking of how you want your downtown to be, and how can we kind of reprioritize the urban network in our city to better facilitate more efficient modes. So to conclude these three recommended approaches, I feel Minneapolis should approach this as a goal of reducing through-car traffic, In order to do that, you prioritize the most efficient modes. That's the overall goal. Step one, select a corridor, right? So they could be Hennepin Avenue, it could be Washington. There's obviously work being done there. I'm just saying a random place. But finding an area that you feel has potential, that is just maybe a little too congested or not working as well as it could be, and select that street, and then select modes that can be reprioritized, and then create and implement a strategy for that. And then on a more longer term holistic vision, using what I talked about with the Amsterdam plus Nets concept or the Utrecht ABC zoning to kind of expand that to the downtown and then even the surrounding areas of the city. But this is a very long-term strategy. And as I showed you with The Hague, they implemented that over 30 years. So this is a very long-term thing, but I think it's very achievable. And one thing I didn't touch on is the move meter, which I'll show you in the next few slides as a way of kind of selecting a corridor and looking at the congestion and seeing how trips can be rebalanced. Does anybody have any questions on this kind of high-level strategy before I move on? Yes, sir.
I would like to know the density of housing and business. I mean, I see these 6-story, 7-story buildings,
Yep.
which is kind of like what we have on Manhattan Avenue, but it doesn't go out that far. So we talk about streetcar and what it costs to build and whatever, that density is important.
Yeah, exactly.
What is the density of places like Utrecht? I mean, like, what is an average housing unit? How much space does one person on average have for a dwelling?
Right. And so that's a great question. So what he's asking is, what is the typical density in the Netherlands, in a city like Utrecht or Amsterdam? I don't know the numbers. It's higher than here for sure.
Right.
But in the urban areas of like downtown Minneapolis, uptown areas that are really dense, I think that's where these strategies are most sustainable, because you have that density, you have people there, you can support other modes more efficiently, like walking and public transit. Does anybody know the density of like downtown Minneapolis?
I see Wes kind of
City is
cringing a little.
City as a whole is like 10,000 people. 7,000 people per square mile. And then like neighborhoods like Whittier is 17,000 people
Okay.
per square mile. Uptown's a little less than Whittier actually.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So does that help, sir?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot more dense, but it'd be interesting to see how much more dense, because you're bringing people in via streetcar, buses, whatever. And if you've got these, car zones, people got to get into the zone. It's sort of like Disney World. They bring people in by buses, but they, it's got to be dense enough where it sustains the cost of the infrastructure.
Right. And I just want to reiterate, the car-free zone is still relatively small in the grand scheme of things, and it's more it's more of a pedestrian mall area. There still is a lot of car access into the city. There's parking ramps, there's underground parking, because they still recognize that cars need to get into the city. People are coming here for work, etc. But there are certain areas where it is more advantageous, where you create kind of this public landscape, kind of like a Nicollet Mall, where you want to limit that car accessibility to allow other modes to flourish.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, sure.
How wide is the metropolitan something like Amsterdam? Because I mean, we're a very small metro area.
So I would say most Dutch cities, their radius is about 5 to 7 kilometers, at least for the urban core. There is sprawl and et cetera, but the urban core is about 5 to 7 kilometers. So let's say 5-mile radius to convert to standard units.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you know how they handle freight delivery within the car-free zone?
So they do allow freight in. So you see a lot of freight trucks and things like that. They also do a lot of bike delivery. So one of my favorite memories of the Netherlands, I was in Amsterdam by the Central Station, and a boat comes in, a DHL boat, right? It comes in, parks in the canal, 4 guys get off with their cargo bikes and deliver bikes. So they're taking packages off the boat on their cargo bikes and delivering them in the city. So it's just really Dutch just to kind of see that. And I'm not going to talk about that in this presentation, but you're starting to see DHL, a lot of big companies do cargo bike freight delivery stuff. So it's a really interesting approach, and is really efficient because the bikes can just get around the city so much quicker than these big freight trucks. Like, you think driving here is a pain? Imagine driving in a city in the Netherlands. Yeah, there's a lot of congestion. Any other questions at this point? Okay. So I'm going to show you all the move meter. So for one of my internships, I worked with a private firm called Holland. They've been operating in the Netherlands for about 50 years, so they do transportation planning, engineering. They do a lot of great things, and one tool that they developed that they allowed me to work on a little bit is called the move meter. And so it's a web-based tool, use traffic modeling data. Essentially it is a traffic model, but it's an online version, very user-friendly, so transportation planners and regular folks can use it. You don't need to have a traffic engineer to run the scenarios and things like that. So it's a really quick, fast way to identify corridors for improvement. And this has been used in Western Europe, in Africa, in South America, Central America, and a few cities here in the United States. And the way it works is that and this is one of the ways, there's a lot of different functions the tool can do, but one of the ones that I really like is they do an origin-destination pattern of short-distance car trips, and the parameter we usually set is about 3 miles. And it looks at the congested areas where there is the highest proportion of short-distance car trips. So in the city of Washington, D.C., this is kind of the urban core downtown area. You see these color codings, and I apologize because it's kind of hard to see the legend, but it goes in proportion of short trips, so 20% up to 100%. So basically, these red, orange areas represent 60 to 100% of these areas that are having a share of short distance trips. There's probably none that are actually 100%. So you're seeing, like, for example, this corridor right here experiences a really high proportion of short distance car trips, as does this corridor and this corridor. So this tool allowed the city of Washington D.C. to identify those areas and think of ways that we can change that from a car trip to another mode, maybe a bus, maybe a bike, maybe rerouting traffic entirely. But it's a tool that I think can be used in conjunction with the recommendations I provided on the previous slide to reprioritize those trips from car trips to other trips. This example is in downtown Houston. A little different kind of metric, but you can see the areas that are the thickest are having the high proportion of short trips. Any questions on the move meter?
So how is this accessible for, like, could we run this for Minneapolis, or is this proprietary?
So it is a proprietary. So Move Mobility is a company. They're a part of Huddlepole Coffins. Huddlepole Coffins is a larger firm, and they have little parent groups under them, and they license the software out to city agencies. So Chattanooga, Tennessee has licensed it. Austin, Texas was using it. Houston was using it. Washington, D.C. was using it. So they license it out, and then you have access to the tool. The only real prerequisite is you have to provide the traffic modeling data. So they load in the traffic modeling data, and then you go on the web, and then you have real-time access to run scenarios. I think it's really effective. It's worked out well for a lot of cities. It's nice because otherwise you're kind of stuck to a traffic engineer. Nothing against traffic engineers at all, but you're kind of tethered to that traffic modeler to give you that data, and they might not have time. I don't know how each office works, but sometimes it can take a bit of time for them to run those scenarios. If you have a quick question, you might not be able to get the response you want. So that concludes the first part of my presentation, which was on organizing car networks, focusing on attractivity of downtown. Is there any questions on this before I move into the next part, which is much more bicycle focused? And we're right at the halfway point, so I think we're doing pretty well on time. So this is the original reason I went to Holland, because I wanted to see what biking was like. I wanted to get a better perspective of the cycling culture. What makes the Dutch embrace cycling? Why does it work so well? What are they doing? And when I went there, I was chatting with my advisor, and he said, Alex, we're the city of The Hague. We've done a lot of transformation in terms of our city center. We have a great cycling city, but we want to make it better. And so what I did was I went to 10 Dutch cities, and you can see they're kind of all over, but they're all listed here. So I went from Amsterdam all the way to Swallow. So I went to 10 cities, I would argue probably the best cycling cities in the world, or you could put them in that category. I mean, some of these cities have 40 to 50% bike mode share, so it's like, it's insane. The only other city that really comes close to that is like Copenhagen. And I went to these cities and I interviewed their bicycle policy advisors and really just had conversations with them. Got on a tram, went to a rail to Groningen and talked to him, went to Leiden, talked to their advisor, and really understood, what are you challenged with? What are some of your solutions? What does the future hold? So bike theft, bike parking, marketing, safety, encouraging non-cyclists, kind of all over the board. And I compiled all of this information into specific strategic recommendations for the municipality of The Hague that they incorporated into their bicycle plan. And what I'm going to present to you all is just the highlights or some of the kind of key lessons learned that I believe have applicability here in Minneapolis. And this to me is really important because cycling here in Minneapolis is what got me interested in this profession in the first place, and which brought me there and which brought me back here. And those of you that know me know I love biking, I cycle all the time, and I could go on. Curious, what do you guys think is the biggest challenge that Dutch cities deal with in terms of cycling?
Parking.
Yep, exactly.
Just guessing.
There's too many bikes. So biking is obviously really popular in the Netherlands. The national average is 25%. Some cities are hitting, like, the worst cities are doing like 15-20%. The best cities are doing 50%. So there's just so many bikes, and it's not really a problem when people are on their bikes, but when people are not on their bikes and you have all of this public space being consumed by bikes, it starts to become a problem. And so Dutch cities are really challenged with providing adequate parking facilities. Obviously, this is not yet a problem here, but what are we at now, like 7% bike mode share?
No,
Oh, they lied to me.
we're trending up, but
We're trending up, okay.
3.5 from the last.
Okay.
We hit 5 a couple years ago.
I still
For
think,
Moche to
Okay.
work. Yeah.
so I still think it is valuable to understand just the impacts that too many bikes can have if you don't plan for them, and then how can you provide creative solutions for bike parking. So if you look at like Amsterdam, they're committing to build almost 40,000 spaces in the next 8 years, and they're going to spend 90 million euros. You know, Groningen's going to invest 30 million euros. Utrecht is going to build. They built 4,000 spaces. They have the largest indoor bicycle parking facility in the world, and they're planning to expand it because it's not enough space. And actually, in some cities like Utrecht and Groningen that have such a high population density in those A zones, they're starting to think about how do we prevent through bike traffic, right? So I'm talking to you guys about reducing through car traffic, and they're talking about through bike traffic because they're trying to better organize those systems. And in The Hague, they did I want to show you this video because I love what they did. So The Hague, once again, is the city I was living in, and they as well are space constrained. I'm going to mute this because it's in Dutch, and I don't want to distract everybody, but they found a space, and this is their town alderman, that's like their transportation official planner person, and they found a space in their downtown where they rented out real estate, like a store, and they put in a bike parking lot. So it's adjacent to a coffee shop, there's an arts and crafts store there, you can park your bike there, obviously, there's a bathroom there, there's a shower there, you can get your bike fixed there. And so it's a really kind of high-end approach to bicycle parking, but it's really attractive. And, you know, it makes people want to go there. It encourages people to go downtown on their bike instead of their car because they know they can park their bike in this nice place, they can have a nice cup of coffee, they can shop, they can bring their shopping stuff back and then go out and shop some more, run their errands or whatever. The Dutch put a lot of emphasis in the aesthetic and the attractiveness of their facilities because they want to encourage people to come there. And I think that has a lot of implications in downtown. It's not just about cycling, but how do you make cycling attractive? How do you make people want to come here and stay here and utilize those facilities? And for me, I think this is a best practice example of how to create a good parking solution. Yes, sir.
So who paid for that?
One more time?
Who paid for that?
So the city did.
City.
Yep. So
And do they charge anything for?
no, parking is free. Bicycle parking is free, and there was a big argument like let's charge for parking because we as a city are fronting that cost. But if you think about it, why would you pay? If you charge somebody to bicycle park, you're actually discouraging them from utilizing that mode, and maybe encourage them from using another mode like a car, which has other externality costs that the city faces. So in the city's mind, they want to encourage modes that are the most sustainable, the most efficient. So they make bike parking free, because when they do that, more people use their bikes.
What about the vendors? Do they get a discount, or do they get a food vendor or some other service? I mean, do they pay a lot?
So a food vendor pay for what?
Well, you show it in your video.
Yep.
There's services there, like
Yeah.
it's in retail.
Yeah, there is.
And so the city leases that space to vendors.
So the city purchased, so it's kind of like a big, I don't have a chalkboard here. It's a big building, and the city essentially paid for half of that building.
Okay.
So the other half is the cafe that you saw in the video and the arts and crafts store. And from their standpoint, from a vendor standpoint, you're bringing that much more foot traffic into our building, because now there's 50 bicycle parking spots, which are essentially customers that are coming right next to my coffee shop to park. It's like you're putting in a parking lot there for them, that they have automatic access to all those customers.
But I'm more interested in the business model and how it shakes out, because people want to see a downtown bike park here. The reason it hasn't happened is because rents are high downtown. Or
Yeah.
The fact that space is highly coveted and it costs, you can't pencil out.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't make enough money to make it go.
So you're right, it is a very complex business model. The gentleman that worked on it spent a lot of time kind of constructing that, and I don't know the specifics of it, but the city did it in a kind of a trial run. So there is risk, yes, because they're not charging a fee. They are leasing out expensive real estate in a downtown commercial area that is obviously very expensive, and they're kind of doing it as a test pilot. And I can't speak to the nuanced financial components just because I wasn't involved in that, but you are bringing up very valid points that I'm sure.
Even in the most bike-friendly city in the world, it's still highly subsidized.
The parking is yes. And
And rightly so, I get it, but it's the business model that I'm interested in.
and originally bicycle parking in Holland in most places wasn't free. And then they kind of, it's free for the first 24 hours. And then after that, they start to charge, because otherwise people leave their bikes for a week, a month, and things like that. So any other questions on this? So the takeaways: invest in parking, make it creative and desirable to encourage people to come and use it. And I think it also says something about how much importance the city places on bicycle parking, that they're willing to invest this much money in it because they want to make it desirable by the consumers. So, spent a lot of time in the Netherlands. Not many people knew Minneapolis was a cycling city, but everybody knew about Portland. So it was interesting to me, because I feel like Minneapolis is a better city for cycling than Portland. Obviously, I'm biased, and I have friends in Portland who are probably going to see this video and get mad at me. I'm sorry. But I think it says a lot about marketing and branding. And when I was in Holland, I saw the way they approached their branding and their marketing for the bicycle. And if you look at like the city of Groningen, they even adopted a 050. So they took the bicycle, they took the city zip code 050, made it the brand for the city. You know, they even have it on their stoplights. If you go to Amsterdam, you get out of Central Station and you see this Triple X, which is Amsterdam, loves the bike, and Utrecht, we all cycle. And I don't always see that stuff here in Minneapolis, and it kind of makes me wonder why, because we're a great cycling city. The people that cycle know that, but I don't know if the general public knows that. And also, if you look at the way a city like Eindhoven, so has anyone ever seen the Holland Ring? Okay. So I would argue that this is probably the most iconic piece of bicycle infrastructure in the world. And it says something. It's the Holland Ring. It's in Eindhoven, in like the southeast of the Netherlands. So this is a bicycle bridge, and then there's cars under it. Did that answer your question, Adam? And it says something, when you see this branding, when you see this type of infrastructure, it says something about how the city values that mode in the city and the importance it has. It says it's not just a recreational tool to go for a nice ride around the lake on a weekend. I love riding around the lake on a weekend. But this is a critical piece of infrastructure that we utilize in our society every day. And I think Minneapolis should consider some approach like that. I'm not saying change the city brand. I'm not saying change the city logo to a bike. But start to think about how do we brand and create that awareness with our citizens that this is a really critical piece of a critical mode in an infrastructure that we want to push the envelope on and brand ourselves as a city that's very forward-thinking in how we look at transportation. And Cronin does a really great job of this. So Cronin is a university, it's a college town, so a heavy student population. And they were having a lot of congestion on their primary routes to the campus. So they built a secondary route to the campus that was a little longer, but was a priority bicycle lane. And what I mean by priority bicycle lane is that there was minimal intersections, and at those intersections, cyclists were prioritized. So if you use that route, even though it's longer, you can get to your destination faster. But nobody knew about it because they didn't brand it. So they're like, okay, we gotta brand this. So they created this logo that they spray painted on it. They even put these little energy cans that say Zernike route with the route, handed it out to the campus, to the students. And if you're in the city, it's kind of hard to miss this. Oh, I need to go to campus. Well, I just follow the wayfinding all the way to the campus. In Eindhoven, so remember I showed you the Hoven ring on the past slide, the big circular structure? They have a snail feet route, which means fast route, and it goes around the entire city in kind of like a ring, and it's branded just with this little S. But people know that this bicycle route is a primary bicycle route. Once again, primary means minimal intersections, and at those intersections, cyclists are prioritized. So these route branding, wayfinding approaches are something I think Minneapolis could also utilize with new bike routes and existing ones. I'm not sure of, I know you have the Midtown Greenway and there's a lot of lake trails and things like that. So I'm not sure if there's any new routes coming out, but it's something I think could be utilized and be very effective as well. And thinking about things on a regional level, and it was kind of funny, I live in St. Paul, right on Marshall, right by the Mississippi River, so I was walking along the river and thinking about regional accessibility. And this is a little ahead of the curve for what we're experiencing here, but in the Netherlands, e-bikes are starting to become pretty popular. I don't know where we're at here with e-bikes, but I know in Holland, about a third of bike sales are e-bikes now. And if you look at a typical trip, 25% of trips are under 7.5 kilometers, and 10% of trips are up to 50 kilometers. But an e-bike expands that trip range. So essentially what all this means is you're starting to see people doing more regional commutes for work. So going from the suburbs into the city on their e-bike because they don't have to pedal the whole way. And I think as those start to become more popular here, I think a lot of the Cedar Lake trails and the Mississippi River trails could catch on to this and utilize e-bikes to push people away from driving in public transit to using their bike. And even on a regional level in RM-Nijmegen, so two cities, kind of like Minneapolis and St. Paul, and they have a regional trail that's 16 kilometers long. It's considered a bicycle highway. And I was driving between the two cities in a car during rush hour, and people on bikes were actually going faster than us. You know, so this is just something to consider. And they also have the route branding as well, kind of like I showed you in the last slide with that regional connectivity and that wayfinding to help better connect people with their destinations. So in the last, I think it might have been the fifth slide, I talked a lot about citizen engagement and how to engage the public. This is one of my favorite photos. So in the Netherlands, when all these traffic deaths were occurring, they had this movement called Stop the Kindermoord, or Stop the Child Murder, because children were being killed by cars in the streets playing. And so they staged this demonstration where all these cyclists represent, you know, people that have been killed by cars. So it was really much more of a kind of a citizen political kind of upheaval. And this is really important because it's right by the Rijksmuseum, so this is in like the core of Amsterdam. And the reason I show you this is because these type of movements are what pressured the government to create a more transportation-friendly country. And this DNA still exists in a lot of cities in terms of engage, because they understand the importance of engaging the public. And so the city of Groningen actually created this guide called We Are Groningen Cycling City. Obviously they translated it into English for us. And it's an external transportation plan for the public. So they created two transportation plans. One is an internal one for their city planners and engineers, and the second is an external one here for the public. So they have 5 strategies. It's really user-friendly. They created it to engage the citizens in the public planning process and to give them a document that they could follow to be more engaged. And they even have football players in the guide. So this is a guy from the Groningen soccer team. So this would be like if we put Carl Anthony Towns in our transportation planning guide, right? Or Joe Mauer. Seems a little kind of different, unique, but I think it says a lot about how much effort they put into engaging the public and making their content and their documents public friendly. And I think that's also something the city of Minneapolis should consider as they start to move forward with the planning documents, is how do we better engage the public? How do we simplify some of the complexities of the planning process and then leave them with some content that they can continue to follow us with? And that ties into encouraging non-cyclists as well. So obviously Dutch people cycle, it's pretty popular. One of the challenges that they're dealing with is they have a high immigrant population. So in The Hague, the city I lived in, almost 50% of the population are immigrants. And I know here in Minneapolis, we have a lot of immigrants coming in as well. And they understand that these immigrants come from countries that don't have a strong cycling culture. And they understand that those communities need to be educated and better understood in terms of what those barriers are for their transportation. And it may not be cycling, but what are the barriers for you coming in here as an immigrant, and how can we better help you find a sustainable mode of transportation? And so one of the things they did in the city of Rotterdam was that they started these focus groups with communities. And it's really simple. It's like, we're gonna have focus groups with your community leaders and understand what your barriers are. And then we're gonna implement solutions. So they went to the city of Rotterdam, and they went to the south of Rotterdam, which is a high immigrant area, and they found out that one of their biggest barriers was that they didn't have anywhere to park their bikes, because they live in, more apartment building complexes, no indoor bike parking. Parking your bike outside on a long-term basis isn't the best idea. They usually either get damaged by the weather or vandalized. And so they started to build them indoor bicycle parking facilities. So a really simple solution, they just had to ask the questions. And I believe that the same approach could be implemented here in those communities that don't cycle as much, is how do we better understand what your barriers are? Can we sit down with you and have a conversation and find out what's preventing you from using a bike or from using public transit, and give you solutions that will assist you in overcoming those challenges. So to conclude this section, the goal, improving quality and usage of bicycle facilities. So provide creative and sufficient facilities, and I really think it's creative is a goal I think we should focus on here. You saw in the Netherlands how they really focus on providing things that are visually attractive, inviting. That bicycle parking facility indoors I thought was beautiful. Created some type of city brand or some way of marketing, even with iconic bicycle infrastructure. And then branding and promoting that. We saw how in Groningen they had the routes marked on the asphalt and they passed out those energy cans. Preparing for e-bikes, probably a little bit further off, but something to start thinking about in terms of regional connectivity. And then the 5th, creating a plan like this that's public friendly. From my understanding, the city of Minneapolis is drafting a new transportation plan in the process?
In the process.
Okay, so can we get Carl Anthony Towns in it?
Yeah.
But
we can work
Jimmy
on
Butler maybe? Jimmy Butler. And then last, investing in customized focus groups for those communities with low bike ridership. These are kind of my 6 recommendations for the city of Minneapolis. And then I'm just gonna open it up for questions from the audience. Oh, I just wanna close it. And one last thing, so this is, has anyone seen this cycle path? So it's the Van Gogh bike path. I don't know, I think it once again kind of shows you the pride and the emphasis they place on creating structures that are beautiful. And this is a bike path that collects UV rays, or sun rays, UV, and at night it's illuminated and it represents the Van Gogh Starry Night. And Vincent van Gogh is my favorite artist, and there's a great museum in Amsterdam. If you ever get to go to Amsterdam again, go to the Van Gogh Museum, it's amazing. I went with my brother before. Questions? Yeah.
Do you think the potential for Minneapolis to, do like like a Portland, or just increase amount of individuals that we have who actually use bikes is marginalized because of
Marginalized because of what?
just like our winters are so bad here.
Oh.
Like that kind of discourages. Like I know myself, I'm discouraged if I think that it's so cold. Do you think because of the climate that the marginalized is a little bit, or is it something that another thing?
Oh, I mean, I think for sure in the winter, I don't know the numbers, but I'm sure the moisture drops in the winter. I mean, I myself in the winter take the bus a lot more, so that does impact people for sure. And I think the people that do continue to bike in the winter are kind of diehard in some ways. But I still think there's a lot that can be done in the warmer months of the year, and just changing your transportation patterns. Yeah, like I take the bus a lot more in the winter, and in the summer I bike more. And then you kind of just take the seasons and just kind of adapt to it. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm curious how you think about your 6 strategies as either integrated, or are there one or two that should be the priority? How do you think about how they work together?
So you're talking about the bicycle ones, yes?
Yeah.
So I guess to me, the transportation plan, promotion, I think 2, 3, and 5 kind of go hand in hand because it's about public engagement, marketing. And I feel like that's all very outward facing, and I think those can be lumped together. And I think the other ones are kind of on their own. I don't know, I've never really thought about it like that. What do you think?
I don't know, I think that, I'm not sure, but I like to think a lot about how the strategies work together.
Mhm.
And for example, one thing I was thinking about is how does bicycle branding fit? Do you need to increase the mode share first before you do the branding?
I don't
or
think
not?
so.
Things like that.
To me, I guess I'd probably say the most important one, if I had to pick, would be the branding and promoting. So with the unveiling of new infrastructure, promoting that, and also thinking of a more cohesive, larger brand for biking. And really investing in that infrastructure and those facilities so people understand at a very clear level, wow, this is really important. This isn't just a recreational thing. This is a real mode of transportation that everyone can use.
So you didn't touch on this, but I'm interested in like bike and pedestrian counting, if you came across that at all in your conversations with the different cities, and what sort of emphasis is placed on those sort of efforts now, and then if you have any insight as to like 20, 30 years ago, if that was an important piece of kind of expanding the infrastructure.
Yeah, so they definitely count pedestrians and cyclists. They had an app that they encouraged one of the cities had this app where they encouraged a lot of people to download on their phone, and every time they commuted, they could count the number of people, and more so, they used it more so to understand people's route choices. So I don't know how it works here, but I know there is counting that's done kind of on a specific corridor or area, and they're more interested in how do we understand people's route choices so we can better manage it like that. But it wasn't something that I really dwelled into on my time there, so I can't give really kind of concrete examples. You had a question before, right?
Yeah, I did. I was just curious, what are some of the strategies in that external facing, public facing transportation plan that you mentioned?
Oh, the one on the board? Yeah.
That one, yes.
I'm glad I chose this slide. So bicycles first, so giving bicycles higher priority, a coherent bicycle network. So they're trying to create a network that makes sense so people can get around. Space for bicycles, so they're really constrained for bicycle parking space. So constrained that, I'll show you this picture. I didn't get to talk about this. So they have this red carpet concept because people kind of just park their bikes wherever. They're actually trying to get cities or people to kind of treat their bikes like we treat cars here. We understand that if we go to a destination, we can't just drive our car into the front of the store and leave it there. We have to park it somewhere. And so now they're trying to get people to do that with their bikes, but it's kind of really counterintuitive because people are used to the convenience of just leaving their bike in the front of the store. Well, one way they have a red carpet, so a red carpet, you can't park your bike on there. But everywhere else you can park your bike, like you see bikes everywhere. But it's kind of a mess because people leave their bikes there, they sit there for 2 weeks and then they get towed away by the city. So that's one of their strategies is creating space for bikes, for bike parking facilities. And the last one was the story of Proning, and that's just kind of more on the branding and kind of building that image of a cycling city. Does that answer your question?
I had a question. Did you get a sense of, like, from a historical perspective, at the time when cities in the Netherlands were kind of making that transformation from auto-centric plans, did you get a sense of kind of how, like, I feel like a lot of times things that make it difficult to bike in a city get cited as reasons why we shouldn't make it easier to bike in a city? Like, it's hard to bike, I don't bike, therefore we shouldn't make it easier to bike, so, because I don't bike, kind of. And I'm wondering if you got any insight kind of into, like, the historical transformation, like generational or otherwise, into how that process changed.
It's just like encouraging people to cycle more.
Yeah, and I'm kind of thinking back to the slides from the 80s, where, you know, people maybe were more accustomed to driving. I also wonder kind of how much the things that made driving dangerous, like the dense built environment, might play into that and be kind of incommensurable with American cities. But I'm just wondering if you got any sense of historically how that transformation took place.
Right. So I think, you know, there's a really interesting book. Has anyone ever heard the book Cycling Cities? Yeah, it's a few. It's a really great book, and it actually looks at all these. It looks at cities all over the world, and really focuses on like what they used to be like post World War I, post World War II, and then how after World War II, in kind of this mass automation of cars, cities changed and kind of like started to focus on cars, and then started hopefully to deviate back to bikes. And I think on a really, you know, early 20th century point of view, a lot of people bike because they were working in factories and they didn't have money and cars weren't really a thing then. And so it was kind of maybe more in their kind of DNA to cycle everywhere. And it's really cheap. And if the city makes it cheap and affordable and easy, like for me to go into downtown Den Haag, like I get there on my bike in 15 minutes and it's free parking. I don't have to pay a tram ticket. You know, if I take the train into downtown Den Haag, it takes me 20 minutes instead of 15, and I have to pay €2 each way. So I think it's more just an economical choice in those cities. And here it's kind of on that point where like if you're willing to, like I think here in Minneapolis it's kind of like that, where it's like kind of economical, but it's still kind of not as convenient. Maybe I'll just take the train, or not the train, I'll take public transit, and the culture isn't here like it is in those cities. And I think that's where it kind of comes down to that marketing, or kind of that informing the citizen or making them aware of the cost. And then even in some communities, cycling is seen as a lower class thing. And there's this kind of, we're still trying to overcome the mass marketing that car companies throw upon us, that a car is a symbol of success and a nice car means that you are successful. We're still fighting that. And it's funny because a lot of the things you see here, you realize when you leave America that the power of our marketing and our influence reaches everywhere. And all these countries want cars. You know, people don't love cars. It's not like they don't like cars. It's just, it doesn't make sense to use a car in the city center. Or if it does, you have to be really methodical about how you approach it. And I'm kind of the same way. When I come downtown Minneapolis, okay, if I have to take a car, I'm gonna be really, I'm gonna think about it. If I take the bus, I don't have to think about it. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Going back to like the weather, I think if I remember hearing right, it was either Amsterdam or Copenhagen that like if it was like super nasty out, they would increase transit service to kind of, because so many people do bike, but they kind of like offset people not wanting to take car. I don't know if you like experienced that at all when you were over there. And if you did, like, do you think that's like translatable to like our winters?
So I would say even on a rainy day, you see way more people on the bus. Or the train or public. So on a rainy day in the Netherlands, you see more people using transit services. I don't know personally if they augment that and increase it. I would imagine there probably is some demand modeling that they utilize to change that. The only specific example I can think of is that in a lot of cities, they change the traffic signaling to give cyclists more priority or more green time when they're crossing the streets when it's wet out. So like some of the cities like Groningen have been doing that for 30 years. Some of the other cities like Rotterdam, which are kind of catching up a little bit, are starting to do that now. And so it's called rain sensor technology. And so it's 1 o'clock now. I can stay as long as possible because I don't work today, I'm free. But I just want to be respectful of those that do have to leave. And is it okay if I just keep answering questions, Matthew, or do we get kicked out of here?
No, we got time.
Okay.
Yeah, again, feel free to leave or stay.
Any other questions? My friend in the back.
I want to learn more about the bikes. Because years ago, we explored topic of electric assist bicycles, which you kind of push a lot of the coast. What I understand in other cities is e-bikes are kind of turning into more powerful machines. They're almost like Tesla motorcycles.
Yeah.
And now you get into a situation where an e-bike goes 25 miles an hour.
Yep.
And there's conflicts on trails, there's conflicts on busier facilities. A, our laws even allow you to do this. And B, places that have allowed them have crash problems, safety problems, because of this higher traveling speed e-bikes.
It's a problem in Holland. Amsterdam actually, it is with scooters too, because scooters can use the bike lanes in a lot of that cities. And some of those scooters are going like 35, 40 miles per hour. And so Amsterdam, as of January 1st of 2017, made a law where scooters have to ride on the road and wear helmets.
I saw the traction one guy had in Washington every day. I looked at something on Back to the Future. And he had both feet almost like on a skateboard. He was zipping down the road at like 35 miles an hour.
I think it is a problem. I don't know how much of a problem it is here, but in 10 years, if e-bikes start to become more popular, especially in a city like this with such a sprawled area, like the diehards will ride across the city. And I'll ride 10 miles or whatever, but most people probably are going to want to use something a little quicker. And I think once those things start to become more popular, it's going to start to be a problem here. And I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of Dutch cities, parking and then the scooter e-bike things are kind of some of the biggest challenges. It's kind of like a new emerging technology instead of autonomous cars. And cities are still trying to figure out how do we control this. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions at all? Thank you guys so much. It was a pleasure.